I interviewed Douglas Murray recently. He just wrote a book on Israel and Hamas called On Democracies and Death Cults. He makes what I think is a strong pro-Israel case, focusing on Hamas as an evil organization, evil for its corrupt leadership, who's essentially stealing money from the Palestinian people and allocating the money that is there towards terrorist, militaristic operations versus like building up Gaza. Can you steelman the case for and then against this perspective? Sort of centering, we've been talking about the people, about centering around Hamas, which is like this extremist religious organization. The perspective being like they need to be, as you mentioned before, eliminated before any progress can be made.
Okay, so Steelman Douglas Murray's case, I would say, well, I guess the case is right. Look, Hamas is a fanatical death cult, essentially, which I do think is a fair description of them. There is no question that they have pursued a path that was just devastating to their own people. And there's no question they have not spent the resources they have on, their priority has not been uplifting their own people. Their priority has been, I think, essentially antagonizing Israel into this overreaction so that they can turn world opinion against Israel. I think they've been very effective at doing that. And okay, again, I think the argument would come back to something like, and the people kind of voted for this in 2005, and the people we sure do see a lot of people cheering when Hamas is doing some pretty horrific stuff. And so, hey, you got that on one side, and you have a kind of a country that's much more similar to Western societies on the other side.
If we can just like linger on that, Steelman, what do you make of the celebrations in Gaza after October 7th?
I think it's sickening and incredibly disturbing. I guess the way I look at it, I always, and maybe there is a degree of like naivete to this, or perhaps it's just that I just don't want to allow myself to go down a certain path because I think it leads to such dark outcomes. But I always try to be kind of like against the government, for the people, against the powerful, sympathetic to the powerless. I think that, look, it's sickening. You see big crowds cheering on, people who have been, with these people who have been in captivity for I think some of them for over a year and a half. I also thought when Nikki Haley and other Israeli politicians are signing the bombs before they're launched into Gaza, I found that sickening. I think there's all types, I think like mission accomplished banners and flying on jet. I mean, I think having Bob Hope specials at the end of the Persian Gulf War was sickening. I just think all of it is like horrific. I look at it and I try to say to myself, okay, we had one 9/11 in this country, and we all, like, collectively, we lost our minds as a society. We were ready to go bomb whoever the hell our politicians told us to bomb, and we didn't care how many people it killed. And we killed a lot more than Israel or Hamas has killed doing it. And I try to think to myself, okay, imagine being trapped in what is, people can call it whatever they want to. I do think Pat Buchanan and these guys were right to call it a concentration camp. You're trapped in a 5-mile by 25-mile area where you cannot leave. You are stuck there. You don't have an airport because the Israelis bombed it. You don't have a seaport because they won't allow you. You have no access to trade with the outside world. And you're not suffering through a 9/11. You're suffering through 1,000 9/11s. Your whole life is bad. The people in Gaza their entire life has been being refugees. You know what I mean? Their entire life, there's generations of people have been in this status now. And so, if my society lost its mind after one 9/11, I just have a tough time like judging the people who came up in this environment. But there's no question it is. I mean, it's, profoundly disturbing.
But I wonder how much of the indoctrination is really made the software of their mind permanently anti-peace.
Yeah.
It's like extremify them. And that, it doesn't justify anything, but it's more concerning for the prospects of peace.
Well, I'd say I get your point. It's an interesting question that I don't know if any of us know exactly the answer to, but I would say that um, you know, even after, what was it, 80 years of the Soviet Union, it's like, and there were real debates back then about like the new communist man and whether the minds had been so warped of people that they would never even care about these things like liberty or national identity or independence. And then yet at the end, it was all still there. It was very repressed and it went underground and people weren't allowed to talk about it, but they all still had it. And in fact, I was just listening the other day to this Murray Rothbard speech from like the early 90s, and he was talking about how there was something where there was like a camera crew interviewed like a Chinese family under real deal Chinese communism. I believe it was before Mao Zedong died, and they were just saying all this crazy shit to the camera. Like they were like, would you rather, your sons are like healthy and live good lives, or would you rather they suffer but be loyal obedience to the state? And they were like, we would rather they be obedient to the state, and blah, 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 and all these things. And Murray Rothbard was saying he saw this interview and he was talking to his friend. He was, oh my God, this is horrible. Like, it's hopeless. These people's minds have been warped. And then he was talking to his friend who's like a China expert who had been there a lot. And he was like, no, they're not. That's what they say when the cameras are around. As soon as the cameras go, like, they're. So anyway, I'm just making the point there that like there is like, look, even in the situation with Israel and Gaza, specifically Gaza, not even the West Bank, when you could look at it, when the peace talks were going on, support for Hamas plummeted. When the peace talks fell apart, support for Hamas went way back up. Every time there's an aggressive military campaign, support for Hamas goes back up. So I just think that like I'm more hopeful than not that like you could get to a place where like, but it requires like you have to, like, if you do understand the Ron Paul point about blowback, the General McChrystal point about insurgent math, you just realize that it's like you're fighting in a way that produces more of the thing that you're fighting. And so the first step is to stop doing that. Like your cure is making the patient more sick. So stop doing that. And then let's see if maybe we could heal.
What about the case against the Douglas Murray case of the death cults, and that a fundamental part of this process, Hamas needs to be eliminated?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would just say that, and I'm not saying this as a fan of democracy. I'm not like a big believer in democracy. I believe in liberty, and I think democracy is often not in line with liberty.
The Chinese government paid you to say that as well? Or?
That's literally all I had to get out. But I get to say that what I want the rest of the podcast.
Okay, great,
but there's just
great.
that I had to. No, I don't. Well, no, I mean, my beef with the Chinese government would not be that they don't hold regular elections. My beef with them would be that they silence speech, that they put people in camps and things like that, the surveillance, that stuff. I think, look, when you call Israel a democracy, which I guess is right in the title of his book. And I, full disclosure, I haven't read the book, but I have listened to some of his thoughts on this stuff. I think you run up against a real problem, which is that the creation of the state of Israel, even though he tried to walk away from those comments, as Norm Finkelstein called out Benny Morris for writing in his book 1948, which is a great book, his words were, the Zionist project always knew it was going to involve transfer. That was Benny Morris's words. Now, when Finkelstein was grilling him on this on your podcast, he kind of said like, yeah, but that doesn't mean ethnic cleansing. That could be voluntary transfer. You know what I mean? Like, but the point is, the Zionist settlers, and they spoke about this openly, they all knew they had a major problem, which is like, well, you can't create a Jewish state if it's like 50-50, which is, and in all of Israel, it was much less than 50-50. But even in like the Israeli portion of the partition recommendation, it was very close to 50-50. Now, you can't really have a Jewish state with a 50-50 voter base, because now you're just kind of in a breeding war for the next generation, and or who turns out the vote any more than we could hope. It would be the prospect right now of making America an official Republican state or an official Democrat state. Well, how are you going to do that, man? It's like 50-50 between the two. And so I think what Benny Morris was saying was that they always knew some of these Arabs are going to have to get moved out of here so that we could have more of something, which ultimately where they got to like an 80-20, which is pretty much what Israel's maintained the whole time. Now, Benny Morris could quarrel about whether that necessarily meant voluntary, but when it happened, it wasn't voluntary, okay? So, like, when it actually happened in effect, it involved a massive amount, somewhere between 700 and 800,000 Arabs being forcefully evicted out of this area. Now, that's one thing. You know, a lot of nations are started on some things like that. I suppose if you just did that and then you were left with your 80-20 split and you go, but we have elections from here on out, I guess you could claim it's a democracy. Still seems like kind of gaming the democratic system a little bit. You know what I mean? Like if I just deported 80% of Democrats and then say, look, Republicans win every election, you might be like, yeah, dude, but you didn't exactly get there democratically. You got there through force. But forget that. I'll let that one go and just say, I'll call you a democracy if you just kept being a democracy like that moving forward. The real problem is the occupation that starts in 1967, because look, when you've occupied an area since 1967, you can't even really call it an occupation anymore. It's an annexation. You know, you took these lands. You have control of it. You are what the definition of the government is. And you could call Hamas the government all you want to, but they're not the sovereigns. They're not the final decision makers. Israel's the final decision maker. Hamas does not meaningfully in any way decide the biggest questions about Gaza. I'm talking before this war, not even, pre-October 7th. And so the problem Israel has in order to call themselves a democracy is that there's somewhere between 5 and 6 million people, less now because they've killed a lot of them, but there's somewhere between 5 and 6 million people who live under Israeli control who do not have voting rights. And I just, by any other like reasonable, commonly held standard of democracy, we would not call that a democracy. I mean, like, I'm not even saying this to try to be inflammatory or try to pick on the Israelis. There's things about Israeli society I like. I don't hate the people there. I'm Jewish. I love Jewish people. It's not, but the fact is, that's not a democracy. That's an apartheid state. And that's just, I'm not even trying to be inflammatory when I say this. It's just literally describing what's in front of you. If we in America right now said black people no longer get to vote and black people can only live in these few neighborhoods, we don't get to call ourselves a democracy anymore then. You know, and like, I'm not even coming at this from a pro-democracy point of view. I'm just saying, like, if your defense of them is like, well, we're a democracy, which seems to be the case so much, well, no, you're really not. You're really not, as long as you got millions of people who have no say in their own government. Like, then you're really not a democracy. And so, again, so you could frame it as democracy versus death cult was his language for Hamas. And it's like, all right, you know, it's a little bit difficult to accuse another group of being a death cult when the group you're supporting has killed so many more people than them. Now, I'm not saying that's the only metric. Like, there's other things that are factors too. But the fact is that, like, you have, I mean, I don't know to look over the numbers for the whole history of the conflict, but the amount killed by the Israelis on the Palestinian side versus the amount killed by the Palestinians is 20-1 in Israel's, killing more people. Maybe more than that. I don't exactly, I'd have to look at the numbers. But Israel's killed far, far, far more Palestinians than Palestinians have ever killed Israelis. And so it rings a little hollow to me to just call them a death cult. Like, we're the democracy, even though none of, there's millions of people who can't vote over, who rules them. But they're the death cult. I mean, look, they kill people in a more primitive, barbaric way, I guess you could say. There's something a little bit cleaner about, like, when it's done by a government. And it's collateral damage, and it was done with sophisticated weaponry, okay. Still innocent people on the end of those bombs.
Absolutely. But there is, I think, a powerful ethical difference when you mentioned about the 8-year-old girl, right? If you're in your stated goals of the war is to do everything you can to avoid the death of that girl, versus saying, we love death more than we love life, and Israelis, democracy or not, are pro-life, for
There's a
life.
little, I mean, okay, I don't 100% disagree with you, but I think if I would say like the degree to which that matters, like at a murder trial, after somebody's been convicted and before sentencing, sometimes the judge will allow them to give a statement. And like if their statement is like, I'm very sorry for what I did and I'm so sorry to the family and this or that, like that might be like life without parole rather than the death penalty. You know what I mean? Like it might make that bit of difference in that. And if you get up there and you're like, hey, I'm happy for what I did, screw the family, blow that might make a judge who was going to give you life without parole give you the death penalty or something. Like it's like that type of margin around the edge. Let's say like you're a really bad guy and I want to kill you, and you're at home with a bunch of women and children, and I know there's women and children there. Like I know for a fact that if I blow up this building, it's gonna kill all those babies. What I would be charged with is murder in the first degree. And the fact that I went in there and said like, well, listen, hold on. It's a shame that I had to kill those babies. I really just wanted to kill that one guy. I wish the babies weren't there. And they'll be like, yeah, but you knew they were there. And you did it anyway. You get murder in the first degree. Maybe it would make some little difference tinkering around with the sentencing at the end of it, but it doesn't like in kind change what the crime is there. And so I just think at a certain point if you're doing something like, look, I'll say maybe with a little bit of an edge, let's say Barack Obama wants to drone bomb, this place to kill a terrorist, and he thinks he can do it without killing any innocent civilians. Does it, and then it ends up killing some innocent civilians. That's one thing. But once you've done it over and over and over again, and every single time it kills innocent civilians, and then there's a wedding and you order a drone bomb strike on a wedding, like, no, you murdered those people. That's murder in the first degree. Like, I just don't. And so, yes, like, like whether you say out loud, oh, it sure is a shame that we got to kill all these kids, when you're doing it over and over and the action you're taking is going to kill more kids, I just don't think it like it's a little bit different, but really not that much. It's still pretty much, and then also when you mix in with that, the fact that like, if you go, and I'm not taking an opinion on the word genocide. I don't even like to get into that conversation. I feel like it just derails it anyway. What Israel's doing, whether you think it's a genocide or not, it's certainly not what most people envision when they hear the word genocide. But if you could look at South Africa's case that they promoted at the International Court of Justice, the whole thing is just quotes from Israeli leaders. And I'm just saying, like, by the way, it's not like they're always saying, oh, it sure is a shame that we had to kill that 8-year-old girl. They like half the time they say that when they're talking to the international community. And then the other half the time, they seem to basically be saying there's no such thing as an innocent 8-year-old girl. And so I guess I just don't find that argument to be very compelling, especially when the thing has been going on for so long.
There is some disagreement I have with you there. I think the thing you're implying is whenever they state it, it's not quite genuine, to some degree, not
No, I'm
genuine.
saying it might be. It might be genuine by some people. I'm not saying it's necessarily not. I'm saying that when there's a lot of people who are saying the opposite, it doesn't seem like it's consistently genuine from the entire, Israeli leadership class. And that even if it is genuine, when some people say it, that's kind of not enough to get away from the fact that when Tucker was on Piers Morgan, he said the thing, he goes, I don't like my tax dollars being used to intentionally kill children. And a lot of people really objected to that word, intentionally, because I think so many of the defenders of Israel fall behind this, like, no, that's not intentional. We're just trying to kill Hamas. But again, like I said, we would never accept that standard in like a domestic murder case. It's like, no, like the thing is that if there are kids there and they're going to die, then that's intent.
I think I agree with you fundamentally, because war is hell, and that's why I'm against war. But there is a difference. So like, I think we're like mixing in a lot of things. I think you're fundamentally against war, and that's why to you it really doesn't matter. It is murder.
Right.
It's just murder, and we shouldn't do murder. And there's a lot of democracies with colorful flags and that justify murder because they're trying very hard not to kill civilians. And then when you look at the reality of the Obama administration, the entirety of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, you're murdering civilians. Yes, you're trying to kill bad guys, but you're murdering civilians. That said, on a ethical consideration on which kind of ideologies you can build a society after the war, one that even on the surface level states that the value of every life, of every civilian life, is equal and high in value. That's a good society. That's the concern with extremist ideology that that basically is very difficult to build a flourishing society on. But then the argument against that is the one you said, which is like, yeah, well, Hamas is really supported now because of the war.
Right. But by the way, I don't disagree with the first part of your statement there. I just don't think it's in conflict with what I'm stating. It's like, look, I understand, first of all, that like there is a difference between the way you're going to say prosecute crime domestically within your own country and the way you can prosecute crime or what a war between two different countries, right? Like maybe it's not exactly the same. You don't have cops that you can just send in. You can't arrest somebody and put them on trial. It's not the same. So like fine, you could say, but the point I'm making is more like I'm just saying how we would think about these things in a domestic setting. We're talking about like morality here. And morality by its very nature is something that rises above it rises above logistics. It rises above like nationalities or governments or borders or any of those things. Like what's right or wrong, like if it's wrong to rape somebody in New Jersey, it's also wrong to rape somebody in Central Africa. Like it does. And so I'm just saying you're committing the same act that we would consider murder in the first degree here. And then just to go one step further, I think particularly like part of the reasons why people have different attitudes about the way two nations fight, like what we think of as war versus what we think as like say like a policing issue, like we would never accept the idea that like if whatever the logic that's used in wars, used in World War II, even used in Iraq and Afghanistan, especially used in the war in Gaza, if there was a bad guy, even a guy who had done something like October 7th, at which we have school shooters and things like that here, if there was an active duty school shooter and he's in a school shooting people and we know he's already killed like 25 people, blow up the school. He's using them as human shields. No, it's not our fault. You see, listen, those deaths, Lex, while tragic, were the school shooter's fault because he used all these people as human shields. We would never for a goddamn second, if those were our kids in there, we'd never accept that excuse. Be like, what? Yeah, that guy was bad. You still had an obligation to do something else. That was never accepted. Now, that we may look at things differently in the context of a war, but also, by the way, I'm not sure I completely do, but typically speaking, when people think of wars, they're thinking of this government versus this military versus this military. That's not the situation here. So like while Israel is saying, hey, they're using human shields, it's also like, and that is true, I think, to some degree. I think the Israelis overplay it a little bit, but there have been, I think, clear instances where Hamas is using human shields. But it's kind of a flip side of a different point. And like the other point is like, oh, well, why aren't they using their army or their air force or their navy? Oh, right, because they don't have any of those. Oh, that's right. So you're fighting a war against a people that don't have a government because you've denied them their right to have one. And so that's the thing where I do think if you've occupied the place since 1967, you almost now take on an obligation that you kind of have to almost conduct this as a police matter. You're not allowed to just because now we are getting awfully close to the scenario that we just laid out. We're like, oh, there's a school shooter, blow up the school.